Usually when we talk about a word, especially one that we use, like every single day there's this expectation of precision.
Right.
Like if I ask you to define water, we might get into the chemical makeup, but broadly, we agree on what it is. It's water.
Exactly.
But what about the word sex? I mean, think about that for a second.
Yeah.
What does the word sex actually mean?
That's a really massive question.
It is.
Yeah.
Because it's this concept that is simultaneously everywhere, plastered across media, driving advertising, embedded in all our internet algorithms.
Oh, absolutely.
And yet it's practically nowhere. I mean, in our actual lived experiences, it's so often just deeply shrouded in taboo and silence and like a really pervasive sense of shame.
Yeah, it's a total paradox.
Well, welcome to Mindset Matters Book Club YouTube channel. Please subscribe and like to hear new book summaries. We are here to navigate through that silence today.
I'm really glad we're doing this because, we are bombarded with the imagery of it, the cultural expectation of it, but we rarely possess the intellectual or emotional tools to actually talk about what it is mechanically or, where our deeply held ideas about it actually originated.
Or how those ideas operate inside our own bodies and minds, right?
Exactly. We tend to assume our desires are purely our own without realizing how heavily they've been drafted by historical forces.
And that brings us to the mission of our deep dive today. We are exploring a truly paradigm-shifting book called The Psychology of Sex by Dr. Meg-John.
It's such a fantastic book.
It really is. And I want to set the table right now for you listening. This discussion is going to fundamentally dismantle what you think you know about desire, arousal, and, well, normalcy.
Yeah, that word normal is going to take a big hit today.
Oh, for sure. We're going to look at how the field of psychology hasn't merely studied human sexuality as like a passive observer.
Right. It's way more active than that.
Yeah, psychology has actually invented many of the strict rules we currently live by. And uncovering the blueprint of those rules is really the ultimate shortcut to understanding ourselves.
And, understanding the dynamics playing out in our own bedrooms, too.
Exactly. So what's our broader objective here?
Well, the goal here is to help us shift from an unconscious adherence to these inherited cultural scripts toward a highly conscious biopsychosocial understanding of our own erotic lives.
Biopsychosocial, that's a mouthful.
It is, yeah. But it just means we want to move away from blindly accepting what a specific era of science deemed normal.
Right.
Instead, we need to understand how our biology, our psychology, and our really complex social environments all intertwine.
It's about pulling back the curtain on how scientific research, which we usually treat as absolute gospel, right?
Oh, yeah, we totally do.
How it has historically shaped and in many ways severely constrained our erotic imaginations.
Precisely.
So I want to start by looking at the lens through which we view all this data. Because before we can properly unpack the psychology of sex, we have to unpack psychology itself.
Which is a big task.
It is. Because there is this really common assumption that science is just an objective mirror held up to reality.
Right. We picture a scientist sitting in a lab observing a phenomenon and just, recording cold, hard numbers.
Exactly. But that completely ignores the human element. What happens when the scientists designing the parameters of the study are themselves carrying massive, unexamined cultural biases?
Well, that tension is the core of a huge ongoing debate within the field, because we generally operate with a very narrow view of psychology.
Narrow in what way?
Like when the average person hears the word scientific, they picture a really specific aesthetic. White lab coats, controlled experiments, isolated variables.
Objective numerical measurement.
Yeah, exactly. We think of classic memory tests, where subjects memorize words flashing on a screen or, behavioral models like Skinner's boxes.
It implies that human behavior can be isolated and quantified cleanly.
Right, and it feels safe because it feels mathematical. The science of mind and behavior totally stripped of messy context.
But the book champions a much broader view, doesn't it?
It does. It argues that at its highest functioning, psychology is a cross-disciplinary intersection. It cannot be separated from history, sociology, philosophy, or geography.
Because we don't exist in a vacuum.
Exactly. Very few critical psychologists believe you can look at human data in a vacuum. Since the 1970s, the field has been totally split on this.
Split between what, exactly?
Well, on whether psychological research can ever truly be neutral or if it is inevitably a political act.
Meaning, like, the researchers' own personal blind spots, their religious upbringings, or even the financial motives of who is funding the study?
Yes.
Those things dictate not just the findings, but the very questions they think to ask in the first place.
That's spot on. And so it splits into two methodologies. Mainstream psychology largely operates on the assumption that objective, value-free research is achievable.
So they like numbers.
Right. It leans heavily on quantitative research, crunching massive data sets to find, universal, immutable truths about the human condition.
And the other side.
Conversely, you have critical psychology, and this operates on the premise that knowledge is always constructed within a specific situation.
Okay, so context is everything for them.
Exactly. Critical psychologists are intensely interested in how researchers manufacture knowledge within a specific cultural zeitgeist.
So they prefer qualitative research.
Yes, things like long-form interviews, thematic analysis of how people describe their lived experiences, and they are intensely skeptical of generalizing those findings to the entire human race.
Well, the book provides some pretty staggering historical evidence for why that skepticism is necessary.
Oh, absolutely.
When you read about the World War I U.S. Army intelligence testing, it completely shatters the illusion of objective science.
It's a really dark and frankly profoundly illustrative chapter of scientific history. It was famously detailed in Stephen Jay Gould's book, The Mismeasure of Man, which our text references heavily.
Right, so set the scene for us. What happened in 1917?
So, in 1917, as the U.S. entered World War I, a committee of psychologists led by Robert Yerkes developed intelligence tests to evaluate over 1.7 million Army recruits.
Which is a massive data set.
Huge. And at the time, this was heralded as the absolute pinnacle of scientific rigor. They created the Army Alpha test for literates and the Army Beta test for illiterates and non-English speakers.
But the architecture of those tests was fundamentally rigged, wasn't it?
Oh, completely. And the results were weaponized to devastating effect.
What did the researchers claim the data showed?
Well, the psychologists analyzed this massive data set and concluded that the average intelligence of the recruits demonstrably decreased with the darkness of their skin.
Wow.
Yeah. Black recruits, as well as recent immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, including Jewish immigrants, scored the lowest.
And because the consensus at the time was that intelligence was purely genetic.
Exactly. They presented this as objective proof that different racial groups possess naturally inferior intellectual capacities.
I know we look back on that now and recognize it as, like, textbook eugenics. Right.
But the policy implications of those so-called objective numbers in the 1920s were catastrophic.
They absolutely were. They dictated global policy. These findings were presented to Congress and heavily influenced the Immigration Act of 1924.
Which established those really strict national quotas.
Yes, it effectively barred millions of Europeans from entering the United States right before the outbreak of the Second World War, trapping countless individuals in the Holocaust.
That is horrifying. And what about inside the military?
Within the military, these scores determined officer training versus frontline deployment.
So the pseudoscience directly contributed to disproportionate casualty rates among marginalized soldiers.
Exactly. It's a tragic example of bias masked as data.
So if we apply the critical psychology lens to those specific tests today, the bias isn't just like a slight margin of error.
No, not at all.
It is the entire foundation of the test.
Right. When you examine the actual test materials, the methodology completely collapses.
Give us an example. What were they asking? Well, recruits who had never spoken English or held a pencil were given visual tests, requiring them to draw specific missing parts on illustrations of, like phonographs or tennis courts.
Tennis courts for poor immigrants in 1917.
Exactly. And the Alpha test included questions like, Crisco is a patent medicine, disinfectant, toothpaste, or food product.
That is absurd.
It also asked about the manufacturer of specific revolvers or the location of Cornell University.
So if you were a Jewish immigrant who arrived from Poland 3 months prior...
Right, or a black sharecropper systematically denied access to education.
Your failure to identify a brand of shortening did not measure your innate cognitive ability.
Not at all. It measured your proximity to white, middle-class American culture.
That is wild. And, I've also seen this exact same methodological failure applied to gender.
Yes. The book highlights this through Carol Tadros's work in The Mismeasure of Women.
The early conformity studies, right?
Yeah. Exactly. For decades, psychology textbooks confidently stated as scientific fact that women were inherently more likely to conform and less likely to display independent thought than men.
And let me guess, this data was used to keep women out of leadership roles.
You guessed it. It was used to justify keeping women out of executive leadership, higher education, you name it.
But what happened when critical psychologists finally re-examined those studies?
They found a glaring methodological flaw. The researchers had asked subjects to perform tasks or answer questions related to mechanics, sports, and machinery.
Topics that, due to the rigid socialization of the mid-20th century, were exclusively the domain of men.
Exactly.
I mean, if you put me in a room and test my confidence on the intricacies of an internal combustion engine, I'm going to look around the room and defer to anyone who seems like they know what they're doing.
Right, precisely the point. When you test people on subjects they are culturally excluded from, they exhibit conformity because they lack baseline knowledge.
It has nothing to do with their biological gender.
Nope. And when later researchers replicated the exact same conformity tests but used gender-neutral topics or topics traditionally associated with women,
Let me guess. The difference vanished.
completely evaporated. The supposed biological difference was just cultural bias disguised as data.
Okay, let's unpack this. So the psychology field isn't looking through a clear glass window, it's looking through a pair of tinted glasses.
I like that analogy, yes.
And if researchers are wearing 1950s era patriarchal lenses, their data outputs a perfect mathematical justification for 1950s patriarchy.
Exactly right.
And if they're wearing 1910 xenophobic lenses, the data magically proves xenophobia is scientifically sound.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
So the immediate question this raises for anyone listening to this deep dive is, how should we navigate the avalanche of modern statistics about sex and relationships?
That is the big question.
Because if clinical psychology could medically pathologize entire races and genders based on cultural blind spots, they have unequivocally done the same with human sexuality.
And that is the foundational argument of the text. The definitions we hold regarding what is normal, dysfunctional, or deviant in our sex lives are not immutable biological truths.
They're constructs.
Yes. They are constructs shaped by the societal anxieties of the era in which they were researched.
It forms this really powerful feedback loop.
It does. Our researchers' cultural assumptions dictate what they choose to study and the metrics they invent to measure it.
And then those scientific findings are published, picked up by magazines, and embedded into popular culture.
Exactly. And then you, as an individual, consume that culture and actively mold your own physical and emotional experiences to fit that manufactured norm.
So how do we break the loop?
Well, whenever you see a new statistic about sexual behavior, you must critically evaluate it. Ask yourself, who funded the laboratory?
All right.
How did they define pleasure or dysfunction in the parameters of the study? And most importantly, whose bodies and experiences were systematically excluded from the data set?
That is so important, which transitions us perfectly into the most fundamental label any of us use, which is sexual orientation.
Right.
If scientific truth is largely a product of its cultural environment, how did the psychiatric field actually manufacture the categories of gay and straight?
It's a fascinating history. To understand this, we have to recognize that the way we view sexuality today as an inherent, immutable identity is a remarkably modern phenomenon.
Wait, really?
Yeah. When we say, I am heterosexual or I am bisexual, we are using an essentialist framework. We believe that orientation is a fixed characteristic of our being.
But that wasn't always the case.
And no, historians of sexuality emphasize that prior to the late 19th century, this concept simply did not exist.
That is wild.
They actually refer to this specific historical moment as the invention of homosexuality.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Are you saying that before the late 1800s, nobody identified as gay or straight? It just wasn't a concept.
Right. If two men were engaging in a romantic or sexual relationship in, say, the 1700s, society didn't view them as a different category of human.
How do they view it then?
They viewed it through the lens of behavior, not ontology. Sex was something you did, it was an action.
Right, like a sin or a crime.
Exactly. Certain acts, like sodomy, were heavily policed, condemned by the church as sins, and prosecuted by the state as crimes.
But committing the crime didn't change your fundamental identity.
Precisely. Committing the crime of sodomy didn't make you a fundamentally different species of person, any more than committing the crime of theft made you a genetically distinct thief.
It was just an illicit behavior that anyone might theoretically fall into if tempted by moral weakness.
Yes.
So what was the catalyst that transformed a behavior into an identity?
This shift occurred when the early sexologists, who were primarily European psychiatrists, neurologists, and medical doctors,
They started applying modern medicine to human intimacy.
Exactly. They were obsessed with classification. They started cataloging every conceivable variation of sexual desire and labeling them as distinct medical conditions or, deviants.
So by naming the homosexual as a distinct psychological type, the cultural understanding completely fractured.
It did. You were no longer just a regular citizen who committed a sinful act. You possessed a pathological condition.
I can see how that immediately weaponized the field of psychology against marginalized groups.
It was a double-edged sword, really.
How so?
On one hand, it allowed the state and medical establishments to pathologize, institutionalize, and subject individuals to horrific cures based on this new identity marker.
Right, creating a profound new axis of discrimination.
Exactly. But on the other hand, ironically, by defining homosexuality as a distinct identity, the medical establishment inadvertently gave those individuals a shared banner.
Oh, I see.
Over the next century, people could organize, build communities, and eventually fight for civil rights based on that exact shared identity.
Wow, that is a really complex legacy. And Freud's influence here is impossible to ignore.
Right, completely.
He essentially wrote the software code that the 20th century ran on regarding psychosexual development.
He really did. Freud was instrumental in cementing an essentialist view into the global consciousness.
What was his main theory?
Well, his theories were complex, but he argued that humans are born essentially polymorphously perverse.
Which means?
It means we have generalized sexual drives that aren't initially directed at anything specific. However, he theorized that through the stages of childhood development, a healthy psychology must coalesce around a specific object and a specific aim.
Let me guess. The object is the opposite sex, and the aim is intercourse.
Exactly. The object must be a person of the opposite sex, and the aim must be heterosexual intercourse. Any deviation from this was categorized as developmental arrest or neurosis.
But that rigid psychoanalytic framework takes a massive hit in the 1940s, doesn't it? When Alfred Kinsey enters the picture.
It takes a huge hit. Kinsey shifts the approach entirely away from psychiatric theory and towards biological observation.
Kinsey is such a fascinating figure. He was originally an entomologist, right?
Yes. He spent the first part of his career studying the taxonomy of gall wasps.
Wasps. That's quite a pivot.
It is. But when he shifted his focus to human sexuality, he approached it with the exact same dispassionate biological rigor he used for insects.
Which was probably sorely needed at the time.
Absolutely. He was appalled by the staggering level of ignorance, moral panic, and lack of empirical data regarding sex in the United States.
He wanted to know what people were actually doing behind closed doors.
Right. He believed you couldn't make moral or medical judgments without first knowing the facts.
But the logistics of his research were unprecedented. I mean, how did he actually get thousands of Americans in the 1940s, which was an era of intense modesty, to admit to highly stigmatized behaviors?
It's brilliant, actually. Kinsey and his small team developed a highly specific, rapid-fire interviewing technique. Yeah, they memorized hundreds of questions and asked them at a blistering pace to prevent subjects from overthinking or fabricating answers.
Oh, that makes sense. Give them no time to lie.
Exactly. And crucially, Kinsey never asked, "Have you ever engaged in masturbation?"
Because that just invites a defensive no.
Right. He assumed the behavior was universal, so he asked, "When did you first engage in masturbation?"
Wow. That completely bypasses the shame reflex.
It really did. And he would cross-check answers within the interview to catch any inconsistencies. Over years, they collected deeply granular sexual histories from over 18,000 men and women.
18,000. That's incredible. And when Sexual Behavior in the Human Male was published in 1948, followed by the female volume in 53, the statistics were explosive.
Explosive is the right word.
They didn't just challenge the Freudian model. They completely obliterated the illusion of 1950s nuclear family purity.
The data revealed a massive chasm between public morality and private behavior.
What were some of the key findings?
Well, Kinsey found that despite intense social and religious prohibitions, 92% of men and 62% of women had masturbated.
Which was shocking at the time.
Very. He also found that roughly 70% of couples engaged in oral sex, which was technically illegal in many states at the time.
Wow.
He documented high rates of premarital sex and extramarital affairs. But his most enduring legacy was the challenge to the gay-straight binary.
Through the Kinsey scale, right, the idea that sexuality exists on a continuum.
Yes. Kinsey's data showed that human attraction rarely fits into neat boxes. His scale ranged from 0, representing exclusively heterosexual behavior and psychic response, to 6, representing exclusively homosexual behavior.
And most people didn't fall in the extremes.
Exactly. He found a massive portion of the population fell into the 1 through 5 range, experiencing varying degrees of attraction to multiple genders throughout their lifetimes.
So it proved that fluidity was actually the statistical norm, not the exception.
Precisely.
I think the Kinsey scale was revolutionary for its time, but looking at it through a modern lens, it still feels a bit restrictive.
It does.
I mean, it essentially charts a single variable, right? The gender of the person you are attracted to relative to your own.
Yes, it operates on a single axis.
But the book argues we need a much more sophisticated map today, introducing Sari Van Anders's sexual configurations theory.
Van Anders's framework is a vital evolution in how we conceptualize desire.
How does it work?
Well, sexual configurations theory posits that our sexuality is a complex, multidimensional constellation. It maps multiple intersecting axes.
Okay, like what?
First, it separates biological sex from gender expression. Are you attracted to specific physical anatomies? Or are you attracted to masculine, feminine, or androgynous energy, regardless of the physical body it resides in?
That distinction alone explains so much nuance that the Kinsey scale just misses entirely.
Absolutely. But Van Anders goes further by incorporating relationship structure into the orientation itself.
Oh, that's interesting. You mean like monogamy versus non-monogamy?
Exactly. Van Anders includes partner number as a core component of orientation.
So some individuals are just profoundly wired for monogamy, and the idea of multiple partners actually diminishes their arousal.
Right. While others are inherently wired for non-monogamy, polyamory, or relationship anarchy.
And including this in the configuration acknowledges that how we connect is just as fundamental to our sexual identity as who we connect with.
It's a huge step forward.
It really seems like we are finally moving past the endless nature versus nurture debate that dominated the 90s.
Oh, thankfully, yes.
For a while, there was this intense biological determinism, the hunt for the gay gene or the attempt to prove that gay men had different sized hypothalamus glands.
Yes, it was heavily focused on biology.
It felt like a desperate attempt to legitimize queer identities by proving they were hardwired into the hardware of the brain.
And the book advocates strongly for a biopsychosocial model, which essentially renders that nature-nurture debate obsolete.
Because it's both.
It's all of it. Sexuality is not purely genetic, nor is it purely a socialized choice. It is the constant dynamic interplay of our biology, our individual psychological makeup, and the profound influence of our social and cultural environment.
That makes so much more sense.
The attempt to locate a single biological cause for orientation often ignores the complex reality that our environments actually change our biology, and our biology dictates how we respond to our environments.
We really can't ignore the intersectional reality of how these configurations are policed.
No, we can't.
The book details how the scientific categorization of sexuality has historically operated hand in hand with colonial and capitalist power structures.
This is a crucial, often overlooked layer.
How so?
Well, the Victorian impulse to classify healthy versus deviant sexuality was not occurring in a vacuum. It occurred during the absolute height of European imperialism.
Right.
The medical establishment frequently mapped deviant or hypersexual labels onto colonized populations or lower-class citizens.
So they weaponized the science again.
Exactly. This pseudoscientific framing was utilized to justify brutal colonial control, forced sterilizations, and economic exploitation.
They constructed an image of the civilized, sexually restrained European elite against the primitive, unrestrained other.
Yes. And we still grapple with the fallout of those early scientific classifications today in the form of deep-seated cultural stereotypes and fetishization.
It's dark, but so important to understand. When you lay all this out, viewing human desire as a fluid biopsychosocial configuration rather than a rigid, lifelong contract is incredibly liberating.
It really is.
It removes the immense existential pressure of having to identify perfectly with one label when you're 18 and then defend it until you die.
It embraces the reality of human change.
It gives you permission to acknowledge that your attractions, your preferred relationship dynamics, and your physical responses can and will evolve as your environment and psychology shift over decades.
Categorical boxes offer the comfort of certainty, but they often require us to amputate parts of our own experience that just don't fit.
That's a great way to put it. So we've seen how our identities were placed into these rigid, historically constructed boxes.
Yeah.
Now, I want to look at how the physical act of sex itself, was subjected to the exact same process.
Okay, let's get into it.
Let's deconstruct the myth of proper sex, specifically the cultural dominance of penis and vagina intercourse, or PIV, and the almighty orgasm.
To investigate this, the author of the book actually conducted an extensive discourse analysis of 65 popular sex advice manuals.
Wow, that's a lot of reading. What did they find?
What emerged was a startlingly uniform cultural script. Across decades of literature, proper sex is rigidly defined.
Does what?
It consists of a specific sequence of events leading to the main event, PIV intercourse, which must culminate in a mutual or at least sequential orgasm.
And the terminology used in those manuals is so telling.
Oh, yeah.
Anything that isn't PIV, like solo sex, manual stimulation, oral sex, is consistently downgraded to the status of foreplay.
They're just the appetizers.
Exactly. If you engage in those acts but don't proceed to PIV, the cultural consensus is that you haven't gone all the way. You haven't actually had sex.
We can trace the lineage of this gold standard directly back through medical history.
To when?
Well, prior to the 20th century, the Darwinian evolutionary framework dictated that the sole legitimate function of sex was procreation.
Therefore, PIV intercourse was the only mathematically necessary act.
Exactly. Everything else was an evolutionary dead end and thus categorized as a perversion.
Which brings us back to Freud, right?
Right. Freud was actually quite radical for his time because he decoupled sex from strict reproduction, arguing that the primary drive was the pursuit of pleasure.
Which, on the surface, sounds like a massive progressive leap.
It was a paradigm shift, but it was incomplete.
Why?
Because while Freud validated pleasure, he still maintained that mature psychosexual development required that pleasure to be ultimately directed toward heterosexual intercourse.
Oh, right. He had that whole theory about orgasms.
He famously and disastrously theorized that clitoral orgasms were immature, and that a healthy woman must transfer her sexual response entirely to the vagina.
Which we now know is anatomically nonsensical.
Completely.
But the people who really took this cultural script and turned it into a hard medicalized science were Masters and Johnson in the 1960s. Their research changed everything.
William Masters, a gynecologist, and Virginia Johnson, a researcher, embarked on a really unprecedented project.
What did they do?
They brought human sexuality into the sterile environment of a laboratory. They observed and recorded over 10,000 sexual response cycles in hundreds of volunteers.
I want to focus on the mechanics of those laboratories because it highlights how bizarre the foundation of our modern sexual knowledge actually is.
Bizarre is definitely the right word.
They weren't just watching people through two-way mirrors. They were wiring subjects up to EKG machines to monitor heart rates, strapping devices to chests to measure skin flushing.
And crucially, they developed a transparent, motorized plexiglass dildo with an internal camera to film the physiological changes inside the vagina during artificial coition.
A motorized plexiglass dildo with a camera.
Yes.
In the 1960s,
Yes.
the methodology was intensely mechanical.
Highly mechanical. By focusing exclusively on measurable physiological data, blood flow, muscle tension, heart rate, they stripped away all the relational, emotional, and psychological context of intimacy.
And based on this highly artificial data set, they developed the famous four-stage sexual response cycle.
Excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution.
They codified the biological script.
Yeah.
They literally drew a line graph of how a human body is supposed to perform during sex.
Exactly. And the consequences of that line graph were profound.
How so?
Well, in the 1970s, Helen Singer Kaplan, a prominent sex therapist, synthesized their work into a simplified three-stage model: desire, arousal, and orgasm.
Which sounds simple enough.
It does, but this was a critical turning point because Kaplan's three-stage model was adopted by the American Psychiatric Association.
Oh, boy.
Yes. It became the literal architectural blueprint for the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders Regarding Sexual Health.
This is where it gets dangerous. Because if the DSM adopts that specific three-step sequence as the definition of healthy human function,
then anyone whose body deviates from that timeline is automatically classified as disease.
that is precisely what happened, right?
Yes. The DSM created diagnostic categories based directly on Kaplan's stages.
Walk us through them.
If you lack the initial desire for sex, you are diagnosed with hypoactive sexual desire disorder.
Like bodies do age, hormone levels fluctuate, cardiovascular issues affect blood flow. We can't pretend biology isn't a factor.
Biology is absolutely a factor, but the medicalization of sex has swung the pendulum far past nuance.
Explain that.
Well, in the era of Master and Johnson, the working assumption was that roughly 90% of sexual difficulties stem from psychological or relational issues.
Like stress, trauma, lack of communication, resentment toward a partner.
Exactly. But today, propelled heavily by the pharmaceutical industry, the cultural narrative treats roughly 80% of sexual problems as isolated organic machine failures that require a chemical fix.
Which explains the multi-billion-dollar industry surrounding Viagra.
And the incredibly controversial, frantic race to develop a female Viagra to artificially stimulate libido.
It exposes a massive flaw in our cultural logic.
It really does. We are pouring billions of dollars into chemical interventions designed to force men's bodies to achieve mechanical erections.
And to artificially compel women's brains to desire sex.
While completely ignoring the context of why the body-mind is refusing to engage in the first place.
Right. We're treating human intimacy like a faulty plumbing system.
A plumbing system, yes.
If the pipes aren't flowing in the mandated sequence, we assume the machine is broken.
It's a very damaging metaphor.
Because if you approach your own bedroom believing that sex is a mandatory 3-act play, and any deviation means you are medically defective.
That intense performance anxiety is practically guaranteed to destroy any organic desire.
Exactly. The diagnostic script itself is likely causing the very dysfunctions it claims to be curing.
Performance anxiety is one of the most potent suppressors of arousal, but the critique of the plumbing system model goes much deeper than just the pressure it creates.
Where else does it cause harm?
This rigid, PIV-centric script actively marginalizes and ignores the biological reality of half the population.
Let's delve into the gendered realities of this script, because the data regarding the orgasm gap is staggering.
It is. Feminist psychologists and researchers have spent decades dismantling the functional-dysfunctional model.
What's their primary critique?
One of their main points is how the diagnostic model treats male ejaculation as the definitive, non-negotiable endpoint of a sexual encounter.
Right. The script dictates that sex is over when the man orgasms.
And women's orgasms, while culturally positioned as a nice bonus, are not treated as structurally essential.
Which creates the orgasm gap.
Exactly. Consistently, across all demographics, men experience climax during partnered sex at vastly higher rates than women.
And a massive part of that gap comes down to a fundamental misunderstanding of anatomy, perpetuated by the medical community's obsession with the vagina over the clitoris.
Absolutely. Even in modern research, the tools used reflect this bias.
Like what?
Researchers frequently use vaginal photoplethysmographs, which are devices inserted into the vagina to measure changes in blood flow as the primary metric for female arousal.
Wow.
Yet, embryologically and neurologically, the clitoris is the direct equivalent of the penis. It contains thousands of nerve endings and is the primary anatomical source of arousal and orgasm for the vast majority of people with vulvas.
The book highlights a critical statistic here.
Yes, that approximately 70% of women do not, and biologically cannot, achieve orgasm from PIV intercourse alone.
Without direct clitoral stimulation.
Correct.
I really need to highlight the sheer absurdity of that statistic against our cultural landscape.
It's quite a contrast.
If clinical data proves that 70% of women do not climax from penetration alone, why does every single representation of sex in media, every movie scene, every prestige HBO drama, every romance novel depict PIV as a magical, friction-based elevator that inevitably leads to mind-blowing, simultaneous orgasms?
Because the media is reflecting the deeply entrenched male-centric script, not biological reality.
It's a self-perpetuating myth.
It is a myth that serves to validate male sexual performance. And this dynamic is violently reinforced by the linguistic framing we use.
Oh, the vocabulary. The book analyzes this, right?
It does. Our vocabulary inherently casts men as active conquerors and women as passive territory. We use words like penetrative or aggressive slang like nailing and screwing.
The active verbs.
Conversely, female participation is framed passively. The vagina is described as enveloping or receiving.
And the most egregious example cited is from that classic relationship manual, Mars and Venus in the Bedroom.
Oh, that one is rough.
It actually advised women who were not in the mood to simply lie still like a block of wood to accommodate their husbands.
It's hard to even hear that.
Telling a human being to disassociate from their own body and act like a piece of lumber so their partner can use them for masturbation is psychologically horrifying.
It is the absolute antithesis of intimacy.
It's deeply damaging. And this PIV exclusive active-passive binary harms everyone involved.
It severely disempowers women, teaching them that their own pleasure is secondary, complicated, or burdensome.
Many individuals spend years disconnected from their own bodies, faking orgasms to protect their partner's ego.
With no actual map of what brings them genuine pleasure.
And for men, the pressure is equally dehumanizing in a different way. It reduces them to mechanical pistons.
It requires men to operate as unemotional performance machines. The script dictates that a real man is always ready for sex, always desires it, and can always achieve a rigid erection on command.
Which is impossible.
Exactly. If a man experiences erectile unpredictability, which is a completely normal, universal biological occurrence, it is interpreted not as a natural fluctuation, but as a catastrophic failure of masculinity.
It breeds deep shame.
And exacerbates the societal demand that men suppress their emotional vulnerabilities.
This book reframes that entire dynamic so beautifully.
It really does.
If a penis fails to get erect, or if a vagina tenses up and refuses penetration, we shouldn't immediately assume the biology is failing.
The author suggests a radical reinterpretation. What if a lack of physical response is actually the body-mind working perfectly?
I love that. Working perfectly to do what?
What if a body that refuses to engage is sensibly protecting itself? It might be protecting the psyche from overwhelming performance anxiety.
Or it might be a trauma response, protecting the individual from revisiting a painful memory.
Exactly. Or, very commonly, it might be the body's honest, physical reaction to a relationship dynamic characterized by resentment, poor communication, or emotional neglect.
Your body isn't a broken machine. It is an incredibly sensitive communicator of your psychological reality.
That is a much healthier way to look at it.
To help dismantle this anxiety, the book discusses sensate-focused therapy. I've heard the term, but how does a couple actually implement that mechanically?
It's a great tool. Sensate focus was originally developed by Masters and Johnson, ironically, to treat the dysfunctions their own rigid models helped create.
Oh, the irony.
It is a structured, multi-phase therapeutic intervention. A couple agrees to a temporary, strict ban on PIV intercourse and often a ban on reaching orgasm.
So you take the goal completely off the table.
Exactly. In the first phase, they engage in sessions of purely non-genital touch. The goal is not to arouse the partner, but simply to focus one's own attention on the texture, temperature, and sensation of the skin.
It's essentially a mindfulness exercise applied to physical intimacy.
That's a perfect description. By removing the end goal of orgasm or penetration, you completely eliminate the performance anxiety.
And then what happens in later phases?
In later phases, genital touch is slowly reintroduced, but still without the goal of climax.
It forces couples to communicate, doesn't it?
It teaches couples to communicate verbally and non-verbally about what actually feels good in the present moment.
Rewiring the brain to experience touch as connection rather than a stepping stone to a mandatory finish line.
Exactly. It dismantles the idea of foreplay entirely.
Manual stimulation, cuddling, tracing a hand. These aren't the appetizer before the real meal. They are the meal.
Yes.
But this raises a broader societal question.
Yeah.
If PIV and the orgasm are fiercely protected as the functional standard, what happens to the desires that fall outside that narrow perimeter?
That is where things get really contentious.
How does the psychiatric establishment and society at large handle the abnormal?
This brings us to the distinction between a dysfunction and a paraphilia.
Okay, define those for us.
A dysfunction, as we discussed, is the inability to perform the accepted script of proper sex. A paraphilia, however, is the psychiatric terminology for a sexual desire or behavior that is directed at an abnormal target.
To visualize how society categorizes these desires, the text introduces a seminal concept by anthropologist Gail Rubin called the charmed circle.
Yes, the charm circle.
It is such a vivid conceptual tool. Walk us through the geography of it.
Rubin wrote this in the 1980s during the height of the sex wars, but the architecture holds incredibly true today.
Imagine a circle drawn on a piece of paper.
Inside the inner circle is all the sex that society deems acceptable, respectable, and good.
What's inside?
It is heterosexual, it involves only two people, it occurs in a committed relationship or marriage, it is procreative in nature, it is vanilla, and it happens in private.
And if your sex life fits entirely within this charmed circle?
Society grants you full moral respectability, legal protection, and systemic privilege.
And outside that boundary?
Outside the circle lie the outer limits. This is the wilderness where society banishes the bad, deviant, or abnormal sex.
Who lives in the outer limits?
This territory includes kinky sex, BDSM, ethical non-monogamy and polyamory, queer sex, sex work, casual hookups, and public or group sex.
And historically, the entire machinery of mainstream psychology, law enforcement, and religion has been dedicated to pathologizing the outer limits.
Exactly. The focus was always what trauma or biological defect went wrong in these people's lives to make them desire these deviant acts.
But the book highlights a fascinating, relatively recent paradigm shift, right?
It does. Critical psychologists aren't trying to cure the margins anymore. They are actually taking notes.
Taking notes.
They're realizing that the outer limits hold the master class on how to actually manage intimacy.
It is a profound reversal.
It really is. Progressive therapists and social scientists are observing that communities operating in the outer limits, specifically the BDSM, kink communities, and ethnically non-monogamous communities,
They have actually developed incredibly sophisticated, advanced frameworks for communication, boundary setting, and consent.
Exactly.
Which feels entirely counterintuitive to the mainstream narrative. I mean, society assumes that kink is reckless and dangerous, yet you're saying it's the healthiest model for communication.
It is the healthiest model because it operates without a safety net.
Explain that.
When you exist inside the charmed circle, you rely on implicit default scripts. A vanilla couple often initiates sex with vague signals, a look, a touch, and relies on assumptions about what will happen next.
Because the script is already written for them.
Right. But when you step into the world of BDSM or kink, you cannot rely on assumptions.
The physical and emotional risks are just too high.
Exactly. It requires absolute clarity. These communities have formalized practices of explicit negotiation.
What does that look like?
Before anything physical happens, partners must sit down and explicitly detail their hard limits, their desires, trigger warnings, and establish safe words.
And they practice aftercare to ensure emotional stability following intense scenes.
Right.
I look at the charm circle like a restaurant with a very strict traditional set menu.
I like that.
If you stay in the inner circle, you just walk in, sit down, and they serve you the standard meat and potatoes. You don't have to talk to the chef. You don't even need to look at the menu. You just accept what is brought to you.
That's a great way to think about it.
But the people operating in the outer limits are ordering completely off menu. To do that successfully without getting sick, they have to walk into the kitchen and have an incredibly precise, detailed conversation with the chef.
About exactly what ingredients they want, what allergies they have, and exactly how the dish should be prepared.
So, if a listener has completely vanilla tastes and is perfectly content eating the set menu, how can they still borrow the tools from the off-menu crowd?
That analogy perfectly captures the dynamic. Because even if you never desire to explore kink, the methodology of explicit consent is transformative for vanilla relationships. Mainstream culture largely views consent as the absence of a no. If your partner isn't actively pushing you away, you assume you have the green light.
Which leaves a lot of room for ambiguity and boundary crossing.
Exactly. The kink community operates on enthusiastic, ongoing consent.
Adopting this means introducing explicit communication into the bedroom.
It means asking, does this feel good? Or, I want to try this. Are you open to it?
It means recognizing that consent is not a blanket contract signed at the beginning of a relationship.
Right. It is a dynamic, fluid dialogue that can be revoked or modified at any moment without guilt.
Which brings us to the final, and I think the most conceptually massive section of the book.
The deep stuff.
The intersection of unconscious sex, trauma, and the interconnected world. Because drawing the lines of that charmed circle isn't just a polite academic sorting exercise.
No, it is a violent societal battleground.
The enforcement of those boundaries is the root of our constant culture wars.
It really is. When we see societal moral panics erupt, whether it's legislation restricting drag performances, outrage over sex education curriculums, or intense anxieties regarding pornography and technology.
The text argues we are rarely actually debating the surface issue.
Exactly. We are engaging in displaced, unconscious conflict over profound existential themes.
When you say existential themes, what are we actually fighting about when we argue about sex?
At its core, the societal regulation of sex is about managing existential terror.
Terror.
Yes. It connects to our primal fears of life and death, contamination versus purity, and the fragility of our own social standing.
Wow.
Most importantly, debates about sexual morality are the battleground where society decides who is granted full humanity and who is relegated to the status of a dangerous other.
So when a culture panics about a marginalized sexual identity, they are projecting their own internal anxieties about societal collapse onto a convenient scapegoat.
Precisely.
And that societal tension filters directly down into our individual bodies.
It does.
The book introduces the concept of the body-mind, suggesting that trauma isn't just a psychological memory stored in a filing cabinet in the brain.
No, it is physically woven into the nervous system.
Tell me more about the body-mind.
Well, the dualism of separating the mind and the body is a fallacy. The body-mind acknowledges that our physiological responses and our psychological states are inextricably linked and constantly communicating.
So we store things physically.
Yes. We store cultural meaning, deeply ingrained shame, and personal trauma within our musculature and our nervous systems.
And this often operates entirely beneath our conscious awareness.
Exactly. For instance, an individual might experience a sudden, inexplicable loss of arousal, not realizing that a specific sensory input, a smell, a specific tone of voice, a type of pressure, has triggered a trauma response stored deeply in the body-mind from decades prior.
It dictates how we react to those broader cultural debates as well. The book talks about the attack-in or attack-out trauma responses.
Yes. When an individual encounters a cultural debate or a personal situation that threatens their deeply held, unconscious sexual scripts, it triggers unbearable feelings of shame, vulnerability, or existential terror.
And to survive those feelings, the body-mind deploys defense mechanisms.
Right. We might attack out, becoming highly aggressive, policing other people's behavior, or engaging in intense online vitriol to project our own shame outward.
Or we might attack in.
Exactly. Internalizing the shame, withdrawing from intimacy entirely, or dissociating from our bodies to avoid the pain.
This requires a massive expansion of how we view our erotic lives.
It really does.
The book highlights communities that are already doing this work, pushing the boundaries of intimacy far beyond physical acts. It discusses asexuality and aromanticism.
Yes, and not as dysfunctions, but as profound challenges to the status quo.
Explain that.
Asexuality, which is the lack of sexual attraction, and aromanticism, the lack of romantic attraction, are entirely valid, complete orientations. They are crucial to this conversation because their very existence challenges the foundational mandates of our capitalist colonialist culture.
What mandates?
Well, we are sold the narrative that a constant sexual imperative, culminating in a nuclear romantic pairing, is the absolute pinnacle of human achievement.
And the only valid metric for adulthood.
Exactly. By existing outside that mandate, asexual and aromantic individuals demonstrate that deep, fulfilling human connection and intimacy can exist entirely independent of sexual desire.
That opens the door to the most mind-bending concept in the book: ecosexuality and queer ecology.
Ah, yes, this is fascinating.
Which, I'll admit, when I first read the term, I thought it was purely metaphorical. But the text frames it as a literal, vital expansion of the human experience. Walk me through this.
It requires us to completely redefine the word erotic.
Okay.
We have been conditioned to define the erotic exclusively as friction between human genitals. However, thinkers like Audre Lorde have long argued that the erotic is a much broader, deeper well of power.
It is the capacity for deep feeling, vital aliveness, and profound connection.
Yes. Ecosexuality, a framework heavily championed by Indigenous writers, Black feminists, and disability justice advocates, takes that expansive definition and applies it to the more-than-human world.
Meaning nature.
Exactly. It posits that we can cultivate a deeply intimate, reciprocal, and yes, erotic connection with nature, with the land, with bodies of water, and with the ecosystem as a whole.
It's the idea that the feeling of awe you get standing in an ancient forest, or the sensory immersion of swimming in the ocean, taps into the exact same reservoir of vital energy that sexual intimacy does.
Precisely. It challenges the anthropocentric arrogance that humans can only truly connect with other humans.
Furthermore, the text connects this to neurodivergent experiences.
Yes, suggesting that an intense, passionate focus on a special interest can also be a manifestation of this broader erotic energy.
It is about recognizing what makes your specific body-mind feel fully alive and vibrating with connection.
That's beautifully put.
I understand the philosophical beauty of this, but I want to ground it for you listening. Connecting sexual trauma to colonial capitalism and suggesting we develop intimacy with the forest is a massive conceptual leap.
It is a big leap, yes.
Especially for someone who tuned in simply because they are frustrated that they only have sex with their spouse once a month. How does expanding our definition of intimacy to encompass the world actually yield practical results in a suburban bedroom?
It relieves an impossible burden.
Tell me more.
In our modern, isolated society, we have placed the entirety of our needs for physical touch, emotional validation, vital aliveness, and existential comfort onto the shoulders of one romantic partner.
And specifically onto the narrow physical act of PIV sex.
Exactly. That is an absolutely crushing amount of pressure for one relationship to bear. The anxiety of maintaining that pillar inevitably stifles desire.
So expanding intimacy takes the pressure off.
Yes. When you expand your capacity for intimacy, when you cultivate profound connections with friends, when you find vital energy in your passions, when you ground your nervous system through a relationship with nature, you decompress your romantic relationship.
You enter your bedroom as a fulfilled, complex organism.
Unburdened by the desperate need for your partner to be your sole source of life force, you stop demanding your body perform a script and start allowing it to authentically connect.
It takes the existential weight off the plumbing.
It really does.
Well, we have covered an immense landscape of thought today. We started by examining the tinted glasses of the psychology field, uncovering how historical biases and outright bigotry disguise themselves as objective science.
It's a lot to take in.
We mapped the invention of sexual orientation, realizing that our identities are not fixed binaries, but fluid, multidimensional configurations.
Moving past the Kinsey scale.
We deconstructed the culturally enforced myth of proper sex, exploring how the medicalization of PIV intercourse and the orgasm marginalizes women and turns men into anxious performance machines.
Dismantling the plumbing metaphor.
We ventured outside the charm circle to discover that the community's society labels as deviant actually hold the blueprint for ethical, explicit communication.
Enthusiastic consent.
And finally, we explored how trauma writes itself into our body-minds, and how expanding our definition of the erotic to include the wider world can actually heal us.
It is a rigorous intellectual journey, but ultimately it is a deeply personal invitation.
An invitation to what?
An invitation to excavate the foundations of your own desires and to rebuild them with intention and self-compassion.
Or leave you with a final provocative thought to carry forward. We have established that the architecture of your sexual desires, your anxieties, and your internal definition of what is normal were largely handed to you by a 19th century culture obsessed with classification and a 1960s medical model obsessed with mechanical efficiency.
That's the reality.
If you could clear all of that away, who would you be and what would you authentically desire if you gave yourself absolute permission to write your own script from scratch today?
That's a beautiful question.
What if the only definition of normal that actually matters is whatever feels genuinely connecting, joyful, and deeply consensual to your unique configuration?
Absolutely.
Thank you to our expert for navigating this incredibly complex terrain with such clarity and insight today. I encourage you to take this newfound awareness into your own life. Be gentle with yourself as you unpack decades of inherited scripts. Welcome to Mindset Matters Book Club YouTube channel. Please subscribe and like to hear new book summaries. Keep questioning the consensus, keep expanding your horizons, and we will see you on the next deep dive.